bridge is a realm of absolute black. The only light, a sickly green glow from the radar scope. Out there, past the steel skin of our ship, is an entire Japanese fleet. We can't see them. We can't hear them. But I can see their ghosts, faint, ethereal blips on my screen. The captain's voice is a low rumble, trusting my eyes, trusting this strange new machine. For months, the enemy has owned the night. They were phantoms. But tonight, we have a phantom of our own. Tonight, we will show them how to see in the dark. This was the razor's edge of naval warfare in the autumn of 1942. For the United States Navy, the night was a hunting ground, and they were the prey. In the suffocating darkness of the South Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy had proven itself the undisputed master. Their doctrine was built around the decisive, climactic night battle, a swift, brutal engagement designed to annihilate their foes. This wasn't a matter of luck. It was the result of a decade of relentless, fanatical training. Japanese lookouts were subjected to grueling drills, their eyes conditioned to pick out the faintest silhouette against a starless sky. Their ships were equipped with the world's most powerful naval binoculars, massive optical instruments that could resolve the shape of a destroyer at ranges American sailors considered impossible. But their true ace was a weapon that had already sent thousands of Allied seamen to the bottom, the Type 93 torpedo. Nicknamed the Long Lance, it was a 24-inch monster, a whisper-quiet killer that carried a massive warhead and could run for over 20 miles, far outranging any torpedo in the American arsenal. It was the perfect tool for night ambushes, and in the narrow, treacherous waters around the Solomon Islands, it had turned the sea into a graveyard. This grim reality had been seared into the American consciousness just 3 months earlier during the Battle of Savo Island. In that catastrophic engagement, an Allied cruiser force was ambushed and utterly shattered, losing 4 heavy cruisers in less than an hour. The most bitter irony was that some of the American ships possessed early versions of radar. But the technology was in its infancy, and more importantly, so was the doctrine for its use. Commanders, men who had built their careers on visual confirmation and the time-honored traditions of naval gunnery, simply didn't trust the flickering phantoms on their primitive scopes. They hesitated, sought visual confirmation, and were slaughtered for it. The Japanese, relying on the honed senses of their lookouts, struck first and with devastating precision. The lesson was clear. Possessing a technology was useless without the faith and the training to wield it as a weapon. This crisis of confidence permeated the U.S. Navy. The night belonged to the enemy, a tactical reality that had strategic consequences. The entire American campaign in the Pacific now hinged on a single, muddy, perpetually bombed-out airstrip on the island of Guadalcanal, codenamed Henderson Field. Holding it was everything. Losing it meant losing the foothold in the Solomons, and perhaps losing the momentum of the entire war. Night after night, Japanese warships, the Tokyo Express, steamed down the channel known as the Slot to shell the airfield and land reinforcements. The waters around Savo Island became so littered with sunken warships that sailors gave it a new chilling name, Ironbottom Sound. It was in this crucible of defeat and desperation that the stage was set for a final, desperate gamble. By mid-November, the situation had reached its breaking point. Accompanying her were the heavy cruisers Atago and Takao, paragons of Japanese naval design, along with a screen of destroyers. Their orders were simple: get to Guadalcanal, unleash a torrent of high-explosive shells onto the airfield, and cripple it beyond repair, paving the way for a massive Japanese troop landing. Against this formidable armada, Halsey had precious little to throw. He cobbled together what he could, forming Task Force 64. It was a force born of desperation, centered on two new battleships, the USS South Dakota and her sister, the USS Washington. Commanding this force was a man who was, in almost every way, the antithesis of the traditional, hard-charging naval admiral. His name was Rear Admiral Willis Lee. Ching Lee, as he was known, was a quiet, studious, almost academic figure. He was also a 7-time national pistol and a rifle champion, and a 5-time Olympic gold medalist in marksmanship. He understood the language of vacuum tubes and radio waves as fluently as he understood ballistics. He had personally overseen the installation and calibration of the advanced radar suite aboard his flagship, the USS Washington. This wasn't just the older, less reliable equipment that had failed the commanders at Savo Island. The Washington carried the new SG surface search radar, a system so advanced it featured a plan position indicator, or PPI scope. For the first time, an operator could see a true map-like view of the surrounding sea, with ships appearing as distinct blips of light. This was a quantum leap beyond the primitive A-scopes that simply showed a spike in signal strength. Lee trained his crew relentlessly, integrating the SG radar for detection with the more precise Mark III fire control radar for targeting. This data was then fed into the mechanical heart of the ship's gunnery system, the Mark VIII Rangekeeper, a brilliant analog computer that calculated the perfect angle and elevation for the ship's massive 16-inch guns. Lee's philosophy was radical. He drilled his men to trust the electronic picture over their own eyes. Where other commanders saw flickering ghosts on a screen and hesitated, Lee saw hard, actionable data. He was creating a new doctrine on the fly, one where a ship could fight blind, striking with lethal precision at an enemy it could not physically see. As Task Force 64 steamed towards Ironbottom Sound on the night of November the 14th, it was more than just a naval force. It was a floating laboratory for one man's revolutionary theory of war, the last fragile shield standing between Henderson Field and annihilation. As the American task force entered Ironbottom Sound, the sea was an ink-black mirror under a moonless, overcast sky. The volcanic silhouette of Savo Island loomed off the starboard bow, a silent, brooding witness to the slaughter that had come before. Aboard the USS Washington, the atmosphere was thick with a controlled tension. Admiral Lee had arranged his small force in a single column, a simple formation for a complex night. Leading the way were 4 destroyers: the USS Walk, the Benham, the Preston, and the Gwyn. They were the vanguard, the sacrificial tripwire intended to detect and engage the enemy first, buying precious minutes for the capital ships steaming behind them. Following the destroyers was the star of the show, the USS Washington, with Lee himself on the bridge. Tailing her was the USS South Dakota, a powerful battleship in her own right, but one that would soon become a victim of its own complex engineering. Lee, calm and methodical, was glued to his radar repeaters, observing the sweep of the electronic beam as it painted a ghostly picture of the battle space. For now, the screen was clear. But out in that darkness, Kondo's force was closing in, a pack of wolves moving with practiced silence. The first warning came not from a lookout's cry, but from the ethereal glow of the SG radar scope. Contacts. multiple contacts, emerging from the rain squalls near Savo Island. It was Kondo's screening force. The Japanese almost simultaneously spotted the American destroyers. Their world-class lookouts, perched high in the ship's superstructure, had done their job. The battle erupted with shocking suddenness. Japanese searchlights, powerful beams of incandescent light, stabbed through the darkness, pinning the lead American destroyers like insects under glass. The night was instantly shattered by the thunder of naval gunfire. Vice Admiral Kondo's cruisers, Atago and Takao, unleashed a perfectly coordinated fusillade. Their gunnery was terrifyingly accurate. Shells rained down on the thin-skinned American destroyers, which were outgunned and hopelessly exposed. The USS Preston took the brunt of the initial assault, shuddering under a series of direct hits that tore through her engineering spaces and turned her into a floating inferno. Almost at the same moment, the USS Waka was struck by one of the dreaded Long Lance torpedoes. The underwater explosion was catastrophic, blowing the destroyer's bow clean off. She went down in minutes. The Benham took a torpedo hit as well, crippling her, while the Gwyn was heavily damaged by shellfire. In less than 12 minutes, Lee's entire destroyer screen had been effectively annihilated. 2 ships were sinking, and the other 2 were crippled and out of the fight. From the bridge of the Japanese flagship, it must have seemed like a textbook victory, another perfect execution of their vaunted night-fighting doctrine. They had shattered the American vanguard with ruthless efficiency and minimal damage to themselves. The path to the 2 American battleships, which they now knew were present, seemed clear. The trap was sprung. But as the ocean burned around the dying hulls of his destroyers, Willis Lee remained focused on the green-hued map in front of him. He wasn't just watching the visible chaos. He was tracking the precise mathematical movements of every ship in the Sound. The loss of his screen was a bitter blow, but it had not blinded him. In fact, it was about to provide him with the perfect distraction. In the heart of the unfolding chaos, a second disaster struck the American force, one far more insidious than shellfire. Aboard the USS South Dakota, steaming in formation behind the Washington, a single catastrophic mistake was made. In the heat of the initial engagement, an engineer, following standard procedure to prevent circuit overloads from the shock of the ship's own guns firing, tied down a circuit breaker. This seemingly minor act initiated a cascade of electrical failures. One by one, critical systems began to shut down. The lights flickered and died. The advanced radar systems, the ship's electronic eyes and ears, went dark. Her fire control computers, the complex mechanical brains that aimed her guns, spun down into silence. In a matter of moments, the USS South Dakota was transformed from one of the most powerful warships on the planet into a blind, helpless giant. She was now sailing in complete darkness, deaf to radio calls and unable to track or engage the enemy closing in around her. The ship's captain was forced to rely on shouted commands through voice tubes, a technology from a bygone era. Her situation went from critical to catastrophic when she sailed directly under the glare of the Japanese searchlights that had been illuminating the burning destroyers. Suddenly, her massive, unmistakable silhouette was painted against the night sky for the entire Japanese fleet to see. Vice Admiral Kondo and his commanders could scarcely believe their luck. There, perfectly illuminated, was a brand-new American battleship, seemingly confused and unresponsive. Every available Japanese gun, from the main batteries of the battleship Kirishima to the secondary guns of the cruisers and destroyers, swiveled and locked onto the helpless South Dakota. A deluge of steel descended upon her. Shells of all calibers hammered her superstructure, shredding armor plate, starting fires, and knocking out communications. It was a brutal, one-sided pounding. The South Dakota absorbed an incredible amount of punishment, with at least 26 confirmed hits, but she was out of the fight, her offensive capabilities completely neutralized. From the bridge of the USS Washington, Admiral Lee and his captain, Glenn Davis, watched this horrifying spectacle unfold. They were just a few thousand yards away, but cloaked in the perfect, impenetrable darkness of a rain squall. The Japanese, utterly fixated on their crippled, illuminated prize, had completely lost track of the Washington. They were so consumed with the kill that their lookouts, their radar operators, everyone, was focused on the South Dakota. It was the ultimate tactical error, born of overconfidence. They assumed the battle was already won. For Willis Lee, this was the moment he had trained for. His ship was invisible, his radars were clear, and his gunnery crews were ready. While the enemy was distracted, the operators in the Washington's radar plot were calmly and methodically tracking the largest target on their screens, a target that corresponded perfectly with the location of the enemy battleship, the IJN Kirishima. They passed ranges, bearings, and speeds to the Mark 8 rangekeeper. Below decks, deep within the ship's armored citadel, the analog computer whirred to life, its gears and cams performing thousands of complex calculations per second. It factored in the speed of both ships, the roll and pitch of the sea, the wind, and even the curvature of the earth. It was solving the perfect firing solution, aiming the ship's 9 16-inch guns at an enemy they could not see. The command came down from Captain Davis, crisp and clear in the hushed confines of the bridge. Commence firing. At a range of just 8,400 yards, point blank for these colossal naval rifles, the USS Washington spoke for the first time. 9 16-inch guns, each weighing over 100 tons, erupted in a single, cataclysmic salvo. The sound was not a bang, but a physical concussion that felt like the entire world was being torn apart. A wall of orange flame and black smoke momentarily lit up the side of the battleship, revealing the silhouettes of men bracing against the shock wave. 9 projectiles, each weighing 2,700 pounds, the size of a small car, screamed through the night sky. These were not mere high-explosive shells. They were armor-piercing rounds, designed with hardened steel caps and delayed action fuses, specifically engineered to punch through the thickest battleship armor before detonating deep within the ship's vitals. On the bridge of the IJN Kirishima, the first indication of disaster was the sudden, horrifying arrival of these metal behemoths. There was no warning, no muzzle flash seen from the enemy, only the instantaneous, brutal impact. The first salvo was a perfect bracket, landing just ahead and just behind the Japanese battleship, a testament to the uncanny accuracy of the Mark 8 rangekeeper. The radar operators on the Washington had provided a flawless solution. The gunnery officer made a tiny correction. The second salvo was fired less than a minute later, and it was devastating. Multiple 16-inch shells smashed into the Kirishima's superstructure. One round hit below the waterline, another tore through the rudder assembly, jamming it hard to starboard. The Japanese battleship, steaming at high speed, was suddenly locked into an uncontrollable turn. She was no longer a weapon. She was a wounded, circling beast. The crew of the Washington, operating with the cool efficiency of a well-drilled machine, unleashed salvo after salvo. It was a relentless, methodical destruction. The engagement became a textbook demonstration of Lee's revolutionary doctrine. The lookouts on the Washington were essentially bystanders, their eyes useless in the enveloping darkness. The fight was being waged by a handful of technicians in darkened rooms, interpreting the electronic ghosts on their screens. They tracked the Kirishima's every move, feeding a constant stream of targeting data to the guns. The 16-inch turrets swiveled silently, tracking the wounded ship with an invisible electronic leash. More hits followed. Shells plunged through the Kirishima's thinly armored decks, igniting secondary explosions. One armor-piercing round is believed to have struck a main gun turret, putting it out of action. Fires raged across her decks, the bright orange flames finally providing a visible target in the night, a target that only confirmed what the radar had known all along. The Japanese sailors were in a state of shock. They were being systematically dismantled by an enemy they could not see, from a direction they could not pinpoint. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Their mastery of the night, their core tactical identity, had been rendered obsolete in a matter of minutes. The hunter had not just become the hunted. It had been ambushed by a phantom, a foe that fought with weapons that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. In just 7 minutes, the USS Washington fired 75 16-inch armor-piercing shells at the Kirishima. It was an astonishing rate of fire, a testament to the crew's relentless training. At least 9 of these monstrous projectiles, and likely more, found their mark, along with dozens of hits from the ship's 5-inch secondary batteries, which had also opened up on the closer Japanese cruisers and destroyers. For the Kirishima, the damage was mortal. Her engineering spaces were wrecked, her steering was gone, and she was taking on water at an alarming rate. Massive, uncontrollable fires raged below decks, and she had developed a severe list to starboard. The once proud battleship, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, was now a helpless, burning wreck. Vice Admiral Kondo, watching the sudden and shocking destruction of his flagship from the cruiser Otago, was faced with a horrifying new reality. His force was in disarray, his battleship was sinking, and he was fighting an enemy who was landing blows from the shadows with supernatural accuracy. The tactical situation had been completely reversed. The confidence and aggression that had characterized the Japanese Navy at night had evaporated, replaced by confusion and fear. Kondo had no answer for this new form of warfare. He ordered his remaining ships to launch torpedoes in the general direction of the Washington's muzzle flashes, a desperate and inaccurate gesture. He then made the only decision he could. He ordered a general retreat, leaving the crippled Kirishima to her fate. He had come to obliterate Henderson Field, and instead his own flagship had been obliterated. As the Japanese force turned and fled into the darkness, the guns of the USS Washington fell silent. Admiral Lee, ever the cool professional, chose not to pursue. His primary mission was to protect Henderson Field, not to run up a score. He had crippled the enemy's main striking force and sent them running. That was victory. Aboard the dying Kirishima, her crew fought bravely to save her. Damage control parties battled the flames and tried to counter the flooding, but it was a hopeless task. The American 16-inch shells had done their work too well, ripping out the ship's heart. Shortly after 3 a.m. on November 15th, with the ship listing uncontrollably and the fires beyond containment, the order was given to abandon ship. Her seacocks were opened to hasten her end. The Kirishima rolled over and slid beneath the waves of Ironbottom Sound, joining the grim flotilla of warships already resting on the seabed. Her loss was a profound shock to the Imperial Japanese Navy. It wasn't just the loss of a capital ship. It was the manner of her death that was so unsettling. She had been defeated not by superior numbers or a cleverer tactical maneuver in the traditional sense, but by a machine. The victory was a stark and brutal validation of everything Willis Lee had championed. He had proven that radar was not just a navigational aid or a scouting tool, but a decisive, war-winning weapon. In a single 7-minute engagement, he had single-handedly ended the era of Japanese night-fighting dominance. Never again would the Imperial Navy sail into a night battle with the same swaggering confidence. The phantom in the machine had shown its face, and it was terrifying. The psychological advantage, so crucial in the Pacific War, had shifted irrevocably. The dawn of November 15th revealed a scene of carnage and victory. The waters of Ironbottom Sound were slick with oil and dotted with the debris of battle. The crippled American destroyer, Benham, her back broken by a long-lance torpedo, was scuttled by her own crew. The USS South Dakota, battered but afloat, limped away towards the sanctuary of a friendly port, her superstructure a testament to the ferocity of the Japanese onslaught she had endured. But Henderson Field was safe. The Japanese bombardment force was in full retreat, their primary objective a total failure. The transport convoy carrying the bulk of the Japanese reinforcements, now stripped of its heavy naval protection, was caught at daybreak by American aircraft from that very same airfield. The planes, along with guns from Guadalcanal-based artillery, systematically destroyed the transports, ending the last serious Japanese attempt to retake the island. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a chaotic and bloody series of engagements spanning 3 days and 2 nights, was over, and the Americans had won. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. The Japanese failure to neutralize Henderson Field and land their troops marked the turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign. From this moment on, the Japanese would be on the defensive, fighting a slow, brutal, losing battle of attrition. The island, and with it the initiative in the South Pacific, was secured for the Allies. But the true legacy of that night's battle extended far beyond the shores of one jungle-choked island. The sinking of the Kirishima was a technological thunderclap that echoed through the corridors of every naval headquarters in the world. It was the moment that electronic warfare ceased to be a theoretical concept and became the dominant reality of naval combat. The immediate result was the accelerated development and implementation of a revolutionary new idea, the Combat Information Center, or CIC. Before this battle, a ship's captain stood on an open bridge, relying on shouted reports from lookouts, radio operators, and radar technicians scattered throughout the ship. It was a chaotic and inefficient way to process information in the heat of battle. The CIC changed everything. It was a system designed to fuse man and machine, to allow a commander to see in the dark, through rain, and over the horizon. The CIC became the standard for all U.S. warships, giving them an unparalleled advantage in situational awareness that the Japanese, who clung to their traditional methods, could never match. The age of the lone captain on the windswept bridge, relying on his binoculars and his gut instinct, was over. The future of naval command was in a dark room, illuminated by the ghostly green light of a radar scope. The victory's ripple effect transformed naval doctrine at a fundamental level. Gunnery, once the sacred art of spotting shell splashes and adjusting fire by eye, was now a science dominated by electronics. The Mark III fire control radar, coupled with the Mark VIII Rangekeeper, became the undisputed heart of the American battleship's offensive power. The system was refined and improved, becoming so accurate that American warships could land their first salvos on targets they had never visually acquired, a capability that seemed like black magic to their adversaries. This technological superiority bred a new kind of confidence. American sailors who had once dreaded the setting of the sun now welcomed the darkness. Night was no longer the enemy's domain. It was an environment where their technological advantages were magnified. Task forces could now maneuver and strike with precision and audacity, secure in the knowledge that their electronic senses gave them an almost omniscient view of the battlefield. The psychological tables had been completely turned. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the consequences were dire. They had built their entire naval strategy around the idea of a single, decisive battle, the Kantai Kessen, where superior spirit and night-fighting skill would overcome America's industrial might. The Battle of Guadalcanal shattered that illusion. Their vaunted long-lance torpedoes, while still deadly, were no longer a guaranteed trump card. Their superb optics and highly trained lookouts were rendered almost irrelevant by an enemy who could see through miles of open ocean in pitch blackness. They were caught in a technological trap. Lacking the industrial base and the advanced electronics expertise of the United States, they could not hope to close the radar gap. They were forced to fight a new kind of war, one for which they were unprepared, their bravery and skill tragically outmatched by the cold, hard physics of radio waves and vacuum tubes. The personal story of Willis Lee is central to this transformation. He was not just a commander who happened to have good equipment. He was the catalyst, the human element that bridged the gap between a new technology and its effective application in combat. His unique background as a world-class marksman gave him an intuitive understanding of the complex problems of hitting a moving target from a moving platform. He saw radar not as a replacement for skill, but as the ultimate tool to enhance it. His quiet, academic demeanor concealed a revolutionary mind that was willing to discard a century of naval tradition in favor of a demonstrably superior method. After the battle, Lee was promoted and went on to command all the fast battleships of the Pacific Fleet, a role for which he was perfectly suited. He continued to refine and perfect the techniques of radar-directed gunnery, training a new generation of officers who would carry his doctrines forward to the final victory. He was the right man with the right skills at the exact right moment in history. The USS Washington and her crew had done more than just save Guadalcanal. They had fired the starting gun on a new arms race, one fought not with armor and shell size, but with wavelengths and processing power. The night of November 14th, 1942, was the true dawn of modern electronic warfare, a legacy that extends from the darkened CIC of a World War II battleship to the networked battle management systems of the 21st century. It was a night when a phantom signal on a glowing green screen became the most powerful weapon on the high seas. To truly appreciate the magnitude of what Lee accomplished, we must delve deeper into the technology itself. The SG Surface Search Radar was a marvel of 1942 engineering. Operating in the microwave spectrum, it provided a much higher resolution than earlier long-wave radars, allowing it to distinguish between the clutter of waves and the solid return of a ship's hull. Its most revolutionary feature, the Plan Position Indicator Scope, was a genuine game-changer. Instead of the confusing one-dimensional A-scope that required a highly skilled operator to interpret, the PPI display presented information in an intuitive map-like format. The ship was at the center of the circular screen, and a sweeping line representing the rotating radar antenna painted targets as it passed over them. An operator could see at a glance the bearing and approximate range of every ship within dozens of miles. It was the birth of true situational awareness. But finding the enemy was only half the problem. Hitting them was another matter entirely. This is where the Mark III fire control radar, known as Mach 3 to the crew, came into play. The Mk3 was a different beast altogether. It was a pencil beam radar, designed not for searching, but for locking onto a single, specific target designated by the SG. Its narrow beam gave it incredible accuracy in determining both range and bearing. The data from the Mk3 was fed via electrical cables directly into the analog brain of the gunnery system, the Mark 8 Rangekeeper. This mechanical computer was a clockwork masterpiece of gears, cams, and differentials, a product of decades of naval ordnance development. It took the raw data from the radar, range and bearing, and integrated it with a dizzying array of other variables. The operators would input the speed and course of their own ship, the estimated speed and course of the target, the barometric pressure, the ambient air temperature, the wind speed and direction, and even the drift caused by the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect. The Rangekeeper then performed a continuous, real-time calculation of trigonometry and ballistics, predicting the exact future position of the target and calculating the precise elevation and deflection the massive 16-inch gun barrels needed to land a shell there. It was a breathtakingly complex system, a delicate dance between human input, electronic sensors, and mechanical computation. The final piece of the puzzle was the human element, which Willis Lee had honed to perfection. The sailors in the radar plot, the operators of the Rangekeeper, and the gun crews in the turrets had to work together as a single, seamless entity. Communication had to be flawless, the flow of information instantaneous and accurate. Lee's relentless drills had forged this human-machine interface into a ruthlessly efficient weapon. When the Washington opened fire on the Kirishima, it was the culmination of this entire system working in perfect harmony. It was the SG radar finding the target, the Mk3 locking on with unerring precision, the Rangekeeper solving the complex firing problem, and a well-trained crew executing the commands flawlessly. This was why the first salvo was a perfect bracket, and the subsequent salvos were so devastating. They weren't just shooting into the darkness. They were performing a complex mathematical equation, and the answer was written in fire and steel on the hull of the Japanese battleship. Let us consider the perspective from the other side, from the bridge of Vice Admiral Kondo's flagship Atago. In the opening minutes of the engagement, everything proceeded according to the well-rehearsed Japanese script. Their superior lookouts detected the American vanguard first. Their gunnery, directed by the finest optical rangefinders in the world, was swift and lethally accurate. The American destroyer screen evaporated under their fire, just as their doctrine predicted. The sudden appearance of the USS South Dakota, brilliantly illuminated and seemingly helpless, was the capstone to a perfect tactical opening. Confidence would have been soaring. The crews were veterans, their morale sky high, secure in their proven superiority in night combat. They were the samurai of the seas, and this was their element. Then, out of the absolute, impenetrable blackness to port, came the thunder. Not the sharp crack of a 5-inch destroyer gun, but the deep, soul-shaking roar of battleship main batteries. The first massive shells, arriving without a visible muzzle flash to give away their origin, plunged into the sea around the Kirishima. The shock would have been profound. Who was firing, and from where? The Japanese lookouts, men who could spot a ship's mast at 20,000 yards on a moonlit night, were staring into a void. There was nothing there. Yet the shells kept coming, each salvo walking closer, the product of an invisible gunner with an impossible eye. When the second and third salvos began to tear the Kirishima apart, shock would have turned to disbelief, and then to a cold, creeping dread. Imagine the frantic commands on the Japanese bridge. Report, muzzle flashes. The lookouts would have screamed back that there were none. Report enemy position. The radio operators would have had nothing, no chatter, no signals to triangulate. They were fighting a ghost. This technological ambush induced a unique form of paralysis. The Japanese command and control system, which relied on visual signals, searchlights, and a rigid adherence to pre-planned maneuvers, completely broke down. How do you fight an enemy you cannot locate? How do you return fire when you have no target? Kondo's order to launch torpedoes was a desperate act, a prayer aimed at the sound of the enemy's guns, but sound is a notoriously poor targeting indicator on a chaotic naval battlefield. The psychological weapon Lee wielded was just as powerful as his 16-inch guns. He had attacked the very foundation of his enemy's strength, their confidence. The Japanese sailors were renowned for their bravery and fighting spirit, but they were now confronted with a form of warfare that seemed to bypass courage entirely. It was disorienting, demoralizing, and deeply terrifying. This moment revealed the critical flaw in the Imperial Japanese Navy's philosophy. They had perfected the art of naval combat as it had existed for a century, but they had failed to anticipate that the rules of the art itself were about to be rewritten by science. Their focus on the human element, the sharpest eye, the steadiest hand, had blinded them to the rise of the machine. As the surviving ships of Kondo's force turned to flee, they were not just retreating from a superior naval force, they were retreating from the future, a future they now knew they could not win. The loss of the Kirishima was a tactical defeat, but the loss of their invincibility in the dark was a strategic catastrophe from which they would never recover. The story of the USS South Dakota. During this battle provides a crucial counterpoint highlighting the difference between merely possessing technology and mastering it. On paper, the South Dakota was just as capable as the Washington. She carried the same advanced radar suite, the same powerful main battery, and the same sophisticated fire control systems. Yet her experience that night was one of total system failure, culminating in a harrowing struggle for survival. The initial electrical fault was a stark reminder of the incredible complexity of these new warships. They were intricate webs of wiring, generators and circuit breakers, and a single failure point, exacerbated by human error under pressure, could bring the entire system crashing down. When her radars went dark and her computers spun down, she was instantly thrown back into a previous era of naval warfare. Her crew had to rely on voice pipes and visual spotting, the very techniques that radar was designed to supplant. This technological regression happened at the worst possible moment, just as she became the focus of the entire Japanese fleet. Her ordeal under the guns of Kondo's force serves as a powerful what-if scenario. Without a functioning radar and fire control system, she was unable to effectively fight back. While her thick armor saved her from destruction, absorbing a tremendous amount of punishment, and undoubtedly saving the lives of hundreds of her crew, her offensive capability was nil. She became a punching bag, a massive steel target that drew the enemy's fire and attention, a role that, while unintentional, proved to be her most vital contribution to the battle's outcome. The South Dakota's blindness created the tactical vacuum that Willis Lee so brilliantly exploited. By drawing the undivided attention of the Japanese fleet, she inadvertently provided the perfect cloak of invisibility for the Washington. Every Japanese lookout, every gun director, every searchlight operator was fixated on the easy, illuminated target right in front of them. This singular focus is a well-known phenomenon in combat, often called target fixation. It blinded the Japanese to the greater threat lurking just a few thousand yards away in the darkness. The contrast between the two American battleships that night is the story of early electronic warfare in microcosm. The South Dakota represents the fragility of the new technology, the danger of over-reliance on systems that could fail under the stress of combat. The Washington, on the other hand, represents the incredible potential of that same technology when it works flawlessly and is commanded by someone who understands its capabilities to their core. Lee's victory was not just a victory of technology, but a victory of system integration, training, and doctrine. He had not only ensured his hardware was working, but he had also trained his human software to a level of peak performance. The sailors on the Washington trusted their equipment because their commander trusted it, and he had drilled them until its use was second nature. The tale of these two sister ships, one blind and battered, the other a silent, all-seeing killer, is the ultimate testament to the fact that in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon is not the machine itself, but the seamless fusion of the machine with a well-trained and well-led human crew. The aural landscape of a World War II naval battle was a symphony of industrial violence, and the experience for the men inside these steel behemoths was overwhelming. On the USS Washington, the dominant sound during the 7-minute engagement with the Kirishima would have been the earth-shattering roar of her own main battery. For the gun crews inside the 16-inch turrets, the experience was a multi-sensory assault. Each turret was a self-contained fortress of steel and machinery, manned by nearly 100 men. The air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and cordite. With each firing, the entire 3-story structure would leap backwards with the recoil, while a blast of compressed air scoured the barrel to clear out embers. The noise inside was so profound that it was felt as much as it was heard, a deep, bone-jarring concussion that vibrated through the very soles of their feet. These men were operating in a world of practiced, noisy choreography, heaving 100-pound bags of propellant and guiding the massive 2-ton shells into the breeches of the guns. They were the muscle of the operation, completely blind to the battle raging outside, their only connection to the enemy being the mechanical commands relayed from the fire control computers deep in the ship's core. They had no idea they were making history. They were simply doing the job they had been trained to do, over and over, with relentless mechanical precision. For the sailors on the exposed decks of the Japanese ships, the experience was the inverse. First came the terrifying sound of incoming shells, often described by veterans as the sound of a freight train tearing through the sky, a rising shriek that ended in a cataclysmic explosion. An armor-piercing shell from a battleship doesn't just explode on impact, it's designed to penetrate deep into the ship's interior. The initial impact is a screech of tortured metal as the hardened cap punches through the steel plate. A fraction of a second later, the delayed fuse ignites the main bursting charge. The resulting explosion inside the confined spaces of a warship is apocalyptic. It unleashes a wave of overpressure, and a storm of white-hot steel fragments, turning compartments into charnel houses. Bulkheads are shredded, equipment is pulverized, and secondary explosions can be triggered as ammunition or fuel stores are hit. The fires that followed were just as deadly, spreading rapidly and feeding on paint, oil, and any other combustible material. The smoke, thick and acrid, would fill passageways, choking sailors and turning escape routes into deadly traps. This was the hell that the crew of the Kirishima endured. They were fighting not only an unseen enemy, but also their own dying ship. The psychological toll of such an experience is immense. It's one thing to fight an enemy you can see and engage. It's another entirely to be systematically torn apart by an invisible force, with each new explosion a fresh reminder of your own helplessness. The contrast in the human experience that night was as stark as the technological gap. For the Americans on the Washington, it was a loud, violent, but ultimately controlled and methodical exercise in gunnery. For the Japanese on the Kirishima, it was 7 minutes of pure, unadulterated chaos and horror, a preview of a new kind of impersonal, industrial warfare where courage and spirit offered little defense against a well-aimed radar beam. The echoes of the Washington's victory at Guadalcanal influenced naval design and strategy for the remainder of the war and long into the Cold War. In the immediate aftermath, the development and deployment of radar and electronic countermeasures became the highest priority for the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships. New and improved radar sets with greater range, higher resolution, and better resistance to jamming were rushed to the fleet. The concept of the Combat Information Center was refined and standardized, becoming the literal and figurative heart of every major combat vessel. Ship designs began to change, with antenna placement and the protection of sensitive electronic equipment becoming primary concerns, rivaling the importance of armor and firepower. The Navy that fought in 1945 was a fundamentally different organization from the one that fought in 1942, and the pivot point was that single night in Ironbottom Sound. Aboard the ships themselves, the balance of power began to shift. The gunnery officer, traditionally one of the most prestigious positions on a warship, now had to share his authority with a new figure, the CIC officer. This new breed of naval officer was a specialist in the nascent field of electronic warfare, trained to interpret the esoteric language of radar scopes and radio intercepts. They were technicians and information managers as much as they were warriors, and their ability to build a coherent picture out of electronic signals was now just as critical to victory as the accuracy of the ship's guns. This created a cultural shift within the Navy, moving away from a service based purely on seamanship and gunnery towards a more technologically minded force. Willis Lee was the prototype of this new kind of commander, and the officers he trained would go on to lead the Navy into the missile age, where the principles of radar detection and guided weaponry he helped pioneer would reach their ultimate expression. The impact on the Japanese was equally profound, though entirely negative. They attempted to catch up, developing their own radar sets, but they were always a generation behind. Their systems were generally less reliable, less powerful, and lacked the sophisticated fire control integration that made American systems so deadly. They were trapped in a technological arms race with an industrial superpower that had lapped them before they even understood the nature of the competition. This growing electronic disparity had a tangible effect on their operations for the rest of the war. Japanese task forces became increasingly hesitant to operate at night or in poor weather, conditions that had once been their greatest advantage. They were haunted by the ghost of the Kirishima constantly aware that an American fleet could be tracking them from over the horizon, invisible and untouchable. This forced them into a defensive posture, ceding the initiative to the Americans and allowing the U.S. Navy to dictate the time and place of major engagements. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was the grim culmination of this trend. American carriers, directed by their superior radar and CICs, detected the approaching Japanese fleet from hundreds of miles away and launched overwhelming airstrikes, decimating the enemy's naval air power without ever coming within sight of the Japanese ships. It was the doctrine of the USS Washington, scaled up to the level of an entire fleet. The principle was the same. See the enemy first, understand their intentions, and destroy them from a range at which they cannot effectively retaliate. It was a formula for victory written by Willis Lee in the dark waters off Guadalcanal. The strategic significance of saving Henderson Field cannot be overstated. It was more than just a piece of contested real estate. It was the fulcrum upon which the entire Pacific War pivoted. The loss of Guadalcanal in late 1942 would have been a strategic disaster of the first order. It would have solidified the Japanese defensive perimeter in the South Pacific, placing their air and naval bases in the Solomons and Rabaul beyond any immediate threat. Australia would have been directly menaced, its lifeline to the United States stretched to the breaking point. The entire Allied strategy of island hopping towards Japan would have been stopped in its tracks, forcing a costly and time-consuming reassessment of the entire war plan. More than the physical loss of the island, the psychological blow would have been immense. After the string of defeats in the early months of the war, the hard-fought gains on Guadalcanal were the first tangible sign that the Japanese were not invincible. It was a toehold, a symbol of American resolve. To have been thrown off the island after months of brutal fighting would have been a devastating blow to morale, both on the front lines and on the home front. It would have validated the Japanese strategy and prolonged the war by years. This is the context in which the actions of the USS Washington must be viewed. The 7 minutes it took to cripple the Kirishima were arguably among the most consequential 7 minutes of the entire Pacific campaign. In that brief window of time, Willis Lee and his crew did not merely sink an enemy battleship. They saved an army, secured a continent, and preserved the strategic initiative for the Allied forces. Their victory ensured that Henderson Field would remain open, that the Cactus Air Force would fly the next morning, and that the Japanese transports would be caught and destroyed at sunrise. It was the linchpin that held the entire American position together. Admiral Bull Halsey, known for his aggressive and often colorful language, understood the stakes perfectly. His order to Lee was essentially a suicide mission. Stop the Japanese bombardment force at all costs. The expectation was that Task Force 64 would be sacrificed to buy one more night for the Marines on Guadalcanal. That the Washington not only survived but emerged victorious, having shattered the enemy's main force, was a result that exceeded even Halsey's most optimistic hopes. It was a testament to the power of a new way of fighting, a victory of quality over quantity, of technological mastery over brute force. The sinking of the Kirishima was not just a naval action. It was the decisive moment that guaranteed the ultimate success of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, and by extension, set the course for the final Allied victory in the Pacific. It was a battle that punched far, far above its weight in the grand strategic calculus of the war. In the grand narrative of World War II, the duel between the USS Washington And the IJN Kirishima often gets overshadowed by the epic carrier battles of Midway and the Coral Sea, or the massive land campaigns in Europe. Yet in many ways, this singular ship-on-ship engagement was more revolutionary. It was a glimpse into the future, a stark dividing line between the old way of war and the new. Before this battle, naval warfare was still a deeply romanticized affair, a contest of seamanship, courage, and the sharp eyes of a lookout. After this battle, it became an affair of electronics, of information dominance, and the cold calculations of a computer. Willis Lee's victory was a quiet one, achieved in the dark and understood at first only by a handful of specialists. There were no dramatic aerial photographs, no soaring dogfights for the newsreels back home. The heroes of this battle were not dashing pilots, but quiet technicians, men who fought not with joysticks, but with dials and cathode ray tubes. They were the anonymous architects of a new age of warfare. The personal legacy of Admiral Lee himself is one of quiet competence and visionary thinking. He was never a self-promoter like some of his more famous contemporaries. He was a thinker, a scientist in a warrior's profession. The USS Washington would go on to serve with distinction throughout the war, her 16-inch guns supporting landings from the Marianas to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She became a legend in the fleet, the ship that had proven the new doctrine, the ship that had seen in the dark. Her crew, forged in that intense November night, became some of the most proficient sailors in the U.S. Navy. The lessons they learned were disseminated throughout the fleet, becoming the bedrock of the training that would lead to subsequent victories. Looking back, the engagement stands as a perfect military case study. It demonstrates the concept of the force multiplier, how a technological advantage properly exploited can allow a smaller or equal force to defeat a larger or more experienced one. It underscores the critical importance of doctrine and training, that having the best equipment is meaningless if you don't have a coherent plan for its use and crews trained to execute that plan under extreme pressure. And finally, it highlights the indispensable role of leadership. Willis Lee's calm, analytical approach in the face of chaos was the crucial element that brought all the other pieces together. For centuries, the pinnacle of naval technology was the optical rangefinder, the apotheosis of the human eye's power. The Japanese had perfected this technology and the human skill required to use it. But on the night of November the 14th, 1942, that entire paradigm was rendered obsolete. The long, patient gaze of the lookout was replaced by the instantaneous sweep of a radar beam. The art of naval gunnery, with its intuitive seaman's eye for splash spotting, was supplanted by the cold, hard science of electronic calculation. This was a change as fundamental as the transition from sail to steam, or from wooden hulls to ironclads. It was a true revolution, and it happened in the space of 7 minutes. The men who fought that night stood on the cusp of this change. The Japanese philosophy of spiritual strength and perfected human skill against the American philosophy of industrial might and technological innovation. In the darkness of Ironbottom Sound, technology won a decisive and irreversible victory. From that point forward, the path of naval warfare was set. The future would belong to the side that controlled the electromagnetic spectrum, that could process information the fastest, and that could place steel on target from beyond the horizon, guided by the unerring senses of the phantom in the machine.